Okay, so today we're looking at Victorian toys and what sort of toys were popular in the Victorian era. We're going to start off by thinking about what toys were probably like back in the 1800s. And to be able to do this, we need to think in historical context. So the 1800s, we're looking at the Industrial Revolution, and we have a lot of new machines being introduced. Not to get confused and think that these machines were running on electricity, they were of course running on steam and coal power. This is going to be a big hint to the types of toys that children had in the 1800s, and it'll give us a lot of information about how toys have changed between then and now. One of the major changes that we will see is not only in the quality of the toys, but also in the fact that toys in the 1800s were strictly mechanical, while most toys today are electronic. Now, I just made a comment about the quality of these toys. If you were to go and look at a toy produced in the Victorian era, these toys were hand painted, they were very well crafted, and they would often last a very long time. And if we think of the toys that we played with when we were young, most of them didn't survive just being played with by us. They were oftentimes either damaged or destroyed. Going to look at a few key words. If you have your leisure summary books, this is a good time to go to the back glossary and to fill these in. If you don't have one of those books, it is posted on Show My Homework for you, or you can simply use a piece of paper to write down the following four keywords. So alphabet bricks, tiddlywinks, penny bazaars, and kaleidoscope. Now, alphabet bricks, these are going to be wooden cubes. They will have different letters on the sides, and they were multi-purpose. You could use these for building, to work on your hand-eye coordination and dexterity skills, or you could use them for spelling and learning all the letters of the alphabet. Now, Tiddlywinks, this is a game that some of us may have played. It was an indoor game. You would have a felt mat with a set of small discs called winks. In the Victorian era, these were made out of tin or out of metal. Today, they're made out of plastic, which is much cheaper. And you have a pot in the middle that you would try to get the winks inside of. A penny bazaar, think of this as the original pound shop. All items in the penny bazaar were roughly 1p, which wasn't a lot of money, but it was certainly money that many people didn't want to spend if they didn't have to. And a kaleidoscope. This is a toy often made with a kind of a cardboard or a wooden tube, and would have pieces of colored glass and paper on the inside. And when you would rotate the tube itself, it would change different colors and different patterns inside the tube to look at. So looking at our four key words, these are essentially just what they look like. So again, we can see the alphabet bricks, different colors. Some of them have numbers and letters. Tiddlywinks, a game that we might be familiar with. Penny Bazaar, this is actually Marks and Spencer's. This was in the late 1800s. They started off as a penny bazaar before they became a department shop. And a kaleidoscope, and something again we may be familiar with. So I know many of you are disappointed that we're not in lessons as usual, which means you don't get to appreciate my type of humor. So I thought we'd give you a joke before we get on to our reading. So here is our Victorian Jack-in-the-Box, and he's asking us for a joke. So he says, which knight made the round table? Of course, it's circumference. So having a look at our reading, you're more than welcome to make some notes here and follow along. We're going to have a look in the early 19th century. Games played in toys, they were very much dependent on the class and the gender, and they were used as a way to educate people for skills later in life. In our study of the medieval era, we know that kids often spent the first about 10 years very close alongside their parents, and the games that they would play were very similar between parent and child, and these games were always based on life skills. Now, boys would often play with things like train sets, farm sets, castles, tin soldiers. These were very masculine toys because boys were expected to go into a masculine role in society. The sons of those who were very wealthy, they'd often be sent to these private boarding schools where they would participate in team games like rugby in order to build character. Now, if you were a rich girl, you would most often play with things like dollhouses, tea sets, toy shops, or expensive dolls. And these were often displayed in glass cabinets as a symbol of wealth within the household rather than to be played with. Some of these dolls were made out of porcelain, which is very easily broken if not handled with care. Girls would also be taught how to embroider. And this is essentially sewing with a very thick thread that you can make very intricate patterns with, or they would learn to recite biblical verses. Now, those who came from wealthy families, irregardless, would go to a finishing school. And this was a method of emphasizing the accomplishments of music and drawing, but above all else, working on that social etiquette. Again, these wealthy children, when they would finish school, they would often inherit the family's fortune, and they'd be expected to be able to socialize with people of a similar class. Looking at the younger children who went to nursery and playrooms within the wealthy households, they would often have a rocking horse. That was seen on our title slide. And again, this was a very common toy in the Victorian era. It doesn't require any kind of power. They could be made in a very intricate fashion and actually using a real horse's hair for the mane and for the tail. Uh, Boys and girls would often play together in nurseries. They would play with Noah's Ark to learn the biblical side of that, or they would go and watch shows at a puppet theater. Dissected or jigsaw puzzles and alphabet bricks, these were used with very commonplace among nurseries because they were twofold in design. They would allow for children to familiarize themselves with the letter of the alphabet, but they would also allow for that imaginative play and being able to use them to build castles or fortresses or make a little town or a city. Tiddlywinks, again, also popular for that fine motor skills and dexterity. Now, we've talked a lot about the rich children. It's time to look at the more regular people or poor children during the Victorian era. And they had a lot less time to play and socialize because they were actually sent to the workhouses within the factories themselves. Now, toys for poor people were usually handmade at home. They were made out of things that could be found around the house. So if you had a clothes peg that had snapped, you could grab a knife and you could shape that into a little doll. If you had some spare paper, you could fold it into a paper windmill. But again, it's focusing on these being handmade at home. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, mass-produced toys became a lot cheaper, and Germany and the USA really led the way in terms of developing toys made out of tin. Now, tin isn't a very common material to use in toys now. Over time, tin rusts and corrodes, and it's not a particularly strong metal, but it was used in the Industrial Revolution because it was easily malleable and could be shaped and cast using dyes essentially to make specific shapes. When photography was developed in the late 1800s and printing techniques became a bit more widespread, you had a lot of books and magazines being produced, and this was quite popular for children. Now, rich kids did all right with books because they could read, but poor children, they could often get some of these books and they would cut things out, cut out pictures, and they could paste them or stick them into scrapbooks. Now, those children who were too poor to have any kind of toys, they spent more time playing outside in the streets and fields and less time actually playing with manufactured goods. Boys would look to be playing football, and much like in the medieval era, a blown up pig's bladder filled with sawdust or rags was the go to as a ball. Girls, they'd play skipping games, they would sing nursery rhymes. Boys and girls would participate in hopscotch together. They could play with hoops made out of very long sticks and twigs, or play with handmade spinning tops. For those who had a little bit more money, you could go down to the penny bazaar and you could buy a pencil, some beads, or even some badges, things that we often take for granted today, but were not widely available to all social classes 200 years ago. Now, the Victorian age became a fascination of the moving image, and we did talk about photography, and we're going to talk a little bit about the first video cameras, or a very primitive version of the video camera. A thaumatrope was essentially taking a piece of paper, as we can see down here, and you would have an image on each side. And if you would twist the strings, just so you can see here, and pull them apart, the paper would flip back and forth quite rapidly, and you could make it appear as though images were moving. This was something that was completely revolutionary to people in the Victorian era. Before the actual video cameras existed, you could have moving images on pieces of paper. These are relatively easy to make. All you needed was some paper and some string, so most people could produce these in the home. And for those who didn't have the money for a kaleidoscope or a magic lantern, this was a go-to toy. So our key points raised today is understanding that the Victorian age was essentially the birth of the childhood. This was the first time in history where children did not all need to go to work. It's not to say that some didn't. We know poor children would go to the workhouses of the factories, but those who had a bit more money to spend at home, they would not have to go into work. Toys were extremely gendered. Girls were expected to play with dolls, while boys were expected to play with soldiers. Games were aimed at introducing life skills such as literacy, caring for infants, and work skills that would be needed later. The manufacturing sector of the Industrial Revolution made toys affordable. Germany and the USA were major exporters of toys made from tin. Again, we know from our study of the USA, when the supply is very high, the demand is quite low. So the more there is of something, the less we have to pay. And if these factories are producing toys en masse, those prices for toys will come down significantly. And even poor children who could not afford manufactured toys, they did have the ability to play outdoors with friends or to make their own toys, like the Thomas rope. So now that you've gone through the lesson, it's time for you to go on to show my homework and to complete your quiz.